Chapter 6. The Hollow Years. The house was quiet, too quiet. Elias sat in his worn leather armchair, staring at the dust particles flowing in the late afternoon light. The house had once been full of sound, laughter, the hum of conversation, the rustling of pages, turning late into the night. Now silence pressed against the wall like a slow-moving tide, swallowing the echoes of life that had slipped away. He was old now, retired, a man who had spent decades studying the human mind, only to lose his own piece by piece. Johannes was still here. The mirror across the room reflected an empty chair, but Elias knew better. He didn't need to see Johannes to know he was watching. "We made it, Elias." The voice slithered through his mind like a shadow. "You and me, just like I always said." Elias exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against his temples. They had fought for years, he and Johannes, a battle neither could truly win. There had been good moments, moments when Elias had believed he was stronger, but Johannes had always been patient, always waiting. "No more distractions," Johannes whispered. "No more love, no more noise, just you and me, old friend." Elias clenched his jaw. He knew he had made mistakes. He had pushed people away, left wounds that he had never healed. He had spent his life trying to untangle the threads of his own mind, only to find himself bound by them in the end. There had been a time when he wanted to fight. Now he was tired. "Are you ready to listen to me yet?" Johannes asked. Elias leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His voice was barely a whisper. "Yes." Chapter 6. A Life Well Lived. The sea stretched out before him, endless and blue. Elias sat on the wooden deck of a small cottage by the coast, a cup of coffee in his hands. The air was crisp with the scent of salt and pine, and the sound of seagulls mixed with distant crash of waves. Retirement suited him. He had spent decades working, helping others understand the complexities of the human mind. There had been challenges, his own struggles, the moments when darkness had threatened to pull him under, but he had fought. He had reached out, and because of that, he had made it here. The screen door creaked open behind him, and familiar footsteps approached. "You're lost in the thought again." He smiled before even turning around. "Always." Myra sat beside him, handing him a fresh cup of coffee. Her hair was streaked with silver now, her face lined with years of laughter and love. She studied him for a moment, then reached out and took his hand. "How are you feeling today?" she asked. Elias considered the question. There were still moments of doubt, still echoes of a voice he had long learned to silence, but they no longer controlled him. He had built a life, a good one. "I'm happy," he said simply. Myra squeezed his hand, and together they sat in peaceful silence, watching the waves roll in. Because after everything, Elias had learned one simple truth. The mind was never meant to be in a prison. It was a place to explore, to understand, and sometimes the only way out was to let others in. Welcome to Chapter 7, A Friend in the Shadows. The kitten arrived on a cold autumn evening, small and shivering, left in a cardboard box outside Elias' apartment door. At first he thought it was some mistake. He had lived alone, spoke almost to no one. Who would leave an animal for him? He hesitated before finally kneeling to peek inside. The yellow eyes blinked up at him, wide and uncertain. Elias felt something tighten in his chest. He brought the kitten inside, setting the box down carefully in his dimly lit living room. The creature was black as night, its fur matted from the cold. It didn't move, just stared at him, waiting. "A gift, Elias?" Johannes murmured from the mirror across the room. "How strange." Elias ignored him. He fetched a bowl of milk, setting it down in front of the kitten, watching as it hesitantly crept forward. He had never had a pet before. His parents were not fond of animals, and growing up he had been too preoccupied with his own mind to think about caring for another living thing. But now, as the kitten lapped the milk, something about its small, fragile existence anchored him. He reached out carefully, and the tiny creature flinched, but he didn't run. Elias let his fingers brush its fur, soft despite the dirt. "You think this will help you?" Johannes sneered. "Something else to love? Something else to lose?" Elias exhaled slowly. Johannes was right. It would be easy to let this kitten in, to give it a name, to let it curl up beside him on lonely nights. And one day it would be gone. That was the nature of things. But for now, it was here. And Elias decided that that was enough. Chapter 7. A Heart That Softened. Elias never planned to get a pet. It was Myra's idea, of course. "You spend too much time alone," she said one afternoon, arms crossed, as she surveyed his sparsely decorated apartment. "You need something that forces you to be present." He had scoffed, waving her off. "I take care of myself just fine." But 2 days later she showed up at his door with a small, sleepy-eyed kitten cradled in her arms. Elias blinked at it. "Myra?" She grinned. "His name is Bruno." The tiny creature let out a pathetic squeak, barely bigger than her palm. Elias stared at it, unimpressed. "I don't do pets." Myra simply stepped past him, setting Bruno down on the floor. "Then he'll do you." At first, Elias resented the intrusion. The first few nights, Bruno cried for attention, waking up at odd hours. He knocked over books, clawed at Elias' couch, and made it impossible to concentrate. But then, something shifted. One evening, after a long day at work, Elias sat on the couch, running a tired hand over his face. Bruno, usually chaotic and playful, curled beside him, purring softly. Elias hesitated before resting a hand on the small creature. Bruno didn't flinch. He simply nestled closer, warm and steady. For the first time in a long time, Elias felt something quiet in his chest. Maybe Myra had been right. Maybe some parts of him needed to be softened. And just maybe Bruno was here to do exactly that. Chapter 8. Lost in the waves. Elias had hoped the ocean would silence Johannes. Portugal was Myra's idea. She had insisted he needed a break, a reset, something to pull him out of the downward spiral he had been circling for months. So against his instincts, he found himself in Ericeira, a small coastal town where the waves crashed endlessly against the rugged cliffs, where the scent of salt clung to the wind, and where for once he wasn't trapped in the stale familiarity of his own apartment. But Johannes had followed. "You really think this distance will change anything?" The voice was smooth, smug, as Elias leaned against the railing of his rental's balcony, watching the Atlantic stretch infinitely before him. "You could be on the moon, Elias, and I'd still be here." He squeezed his eyes shut. The air smelled different here, cleaner, fresher, but inside his mind nothing had changed. Myra had tried to fill their days with movement. Long walks through the narrow cobbled streets, seafood dinners in small family-run restaurants, even a boat ride along the coast. But at night, when the town fell quiet, the shadows crept in. On the third evening, he wandered down to the beach alone. The town was behind him, the cliffs towering over the restless waves. The tide was coming in fast, and he stepped closer, letting the cold water sting his bare feet. "You could let go," Johannes whispered. "Just step forward. The water will take care of the rest." The thought rooted itself deep. He stared at the horizon, the waves rising and falling like a heartbeat. It would be easy. The ocean didn't judge. It didn't whisper. It simply took. But then, a sudden weight pressed against his legs. Elias flinched, stumbling back before realizing. Bruno, the little cat, had followed him all the way from the rental, his small paws sinking into the wet sand, his green eyes fixed on Elias with unwavering trust. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Elias knelt, scooping Bruno into his arms. The cat pressed against him, warm and real, his steady purring drowning out the tide. "Not tonight, Johannes," Elias murmured. And for the first time in a long time, Johannes had nothing to say. Chapter 8. A New Horizon. Elias never thought he'd love a place like this. Ericeira was nothing like the city life he knew. It was slow, sunlit, and vibrant in a way that made him feel like he had stepped into another world. Colorful fishing boats lined the docks. Surfers rode the endless waves, and the scent of grilled seafood drifted through the air. Myra had dragged him here, of course. "You need to see the world beyond your own mind, Elias," she had said with a knowing smile. And for once, he had agreed. They spent days wandering the town, exploring quiet alleyways where blue and white tiles adorned old houses. They sat at outdoor cafes, sipping espresso, watching the town breathe, and the ocean. The ocean was unlike anything he had experienced. He spent hours standing at the cliffs, watching the waves crash, feeling small in the best possible way. One afternoon, Myra convinced him to try something new. "Surfing?" Elias raised an eyebrow as they stood by the rental shop, the scent of sunscreen thick in the air. She grinned. Why not? I think you like it. Elias had laughed at the absurdity of it. But an hour later he was waist deep in the Atlantic, struggling to balance on a board, Madeira cheering from the shore. He fell more times than he cared to count, salt water burning his throat. But when he finally managed to ride a wave, even just for a moment, he felt it. The rush, the clarity. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't analyzing, overthinking, or listening to the echoes in his head. He was just here. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Chapter 9. A Night to Remember. The night air was warm, and the distant sound of the ocean reached them from the cliffs as Elias and Madeira stood on the balcony of their rental in Ericeira. The town below seemed peaceful, the flickering lights from the narrow streets casting a soft glow that reflected off whitewashed buildings. Madeira glanced over at him, noticing the way he leaned against the balcony railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You're quiet tonight, she remarked softly, stepping closer. Elias turned to her, his eyes thoughtful. Just thinking. She smiled. Always thinking. For a moment they both stood in silence, simply taking in the calm beauty of the night. But something about the stillness between them felt different, more intimate. Elias felt the pull of her presence, the warmth of her hand brushing lightly against his arm. His pulse quickened, and for a fleeting second, he wondered if he was finally ready to let go of the weight in his mind. Madeira looked up at him, her expression gentle. You know, you don't always have to carry everything alone. Elias caught his breath. There was a softness in her voice that caught him off guard. It wasn't a call to action, but an invitation to trust. He met her gaze. And what would you have me do? Let go, just for tonight. With a quiet exhale, Elias closed the distance between them. He reached out, his fingers lightly grazing her cheek as he cupped her face. Her skin was warm under his touch, and the connection felt grounding, like he wasn't just looking at her, but truly seeing her, everything she was. Her lips curved into a smile, and then she leaned in, her kiss gentle, but full of meaning. It wasn't urgent or rushed, but something more tender, more rooted in understanding. Elias closed his eyes, focusing on the warmth of her kiss, the softness of her touch, the feeling of being truly present with someone for the first time in a long while. They slowly made their way back into the room, their hands finding each other naturally, without words. There was a quiet urgency in the way their bodies moved together, but it was matched by a profound sense of calm. Neither of them needed to speak. The connection between them was enough. As they finally settled in the bed, the moonlight streaming softly through the window, Elias felt the weight of everything fall away. For once, there was no overthinking, no voices in his head. There was only the present, only Madeira besides him, her presence filling the space with warmth and comfort. In that moment, Elias realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the peace he had been searching for. Something real, something shared. He wasn't alone. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Chapter 10. A Trip to Madeira. The flight to Madeira had been a blur. The excitement and anticipation of a new place couldn't shake the nagging feeling that clung to Elias. He had hoped that getting away from the weight of everyday life would help him find peace, but instead he felt more disconnected than ever. Madeira noticed the tension in him, the way he kept staring out of the airplane window, his eyes distant. "You're quiet," she remarked gently, trying to draw him into conversation, but Elias just gave her a distracted smile. "Just thinking," he murmured, his mind drifting in a place far removed from the beautiful landscapes that awaited them. Upon arriving in Madeira, the islands greeted them with lush greenery and dramatic cliffs. But it all felt too much for Elias. The vibrant colors, the sea breeze, everything felt too loud, too overwhelming. Even Myra's hand in his felt distant, like they were in different worlds. As they toured the island, exploring the levadas and waterfalls, Elias felt an increasing sense of claustrophobia. Every sound, every moment seemed to trigger the whispers in his mind. The island's beauty should have been a balm for his restless thoughts, but instead it only highlighted the darkness that had taken root inside of him. One evening, after a long day of hiking, Elias found himself alone on the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss below. The sea stretched out endlessly, and he felt a pull, a yearning for the silence of deep water. The wind ruffled his hair, and Myra's voice calling out to him from behind didn't reach him. He stood frozen, staring down at the rocky shore below. The noise in his mind had crescended to a deafening roar. The isolation of the island seemed to reflect the isolation he felt in himself. Madeira approached cautiously, her voice filled with concern. "Elias, what's wrong?" But Elias couldn't find the words, and all he felt was the overwhelming urge to escape, to leave everything behind. "I just need to be alone," he said hoarsely, turning away from her and walking back to the hotel, leaving Madeira standing there, unsure of what to do. The night, as the dark sky stretched above him, Elias lay in his bed, unable to shake the gnawing emptiness inside. He had come to Madeira in search of peace, but the more he sought it, the further it seemed to slip away. Chapter 10. A Trip to Madeira. Optimistic version. The flight to Madeira was full of excitement, the promises of new adventures, the allure of the island's natural beauty. All seemed to pull Elias out of the fog he had been in for so long. Myra's excitement was contagious, and though Elias still felt the shadow of doubt at the back of his mind, he was determined to let himself experience the magic of the place. The island welcomed them with stunning vistas, rolling hills, lush valleys, and the deep blue of the Atlantic Ocean stretching endlessly before them. The fresh air felt cleansing, and as they drove through winding roads surrounded by vibrant flowers, Elias could feel a sense of calm slowly creeping into him. During their first day of exploring, Elias was amazed at how different the island felt. The beauty was so vast. It seemed to swallow up all the noise inside his head. As they hiked the levadas, walking along crystal clear streams and misty waterfalls, Elias felt more connected to the world around him than he had in a long time. Madeira was by his side, her laughter light and infectious. She made it a point to draw his attention to the little things. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the tiny flowers growing in the cracks of the stone paths, the smell of the earth after a rainstorm. That evening, as the sun set over the ocean, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Elias found a quiet moment to stand at the edge of a cliff, taking in the view. Madeira stood beside him, her hand slipping into his. There was something deeply comforting about the way the waves crashed below, the sound like a gentle reminder that life, with all its chaos, was constantly moving forward. "You feel that?" she asked softly. "Everything is changing, but it's all still here." Elias nodded. The weight of the world, the constant noise of his thoughts, seemed to dissolve in the wind that swept through his hair. For the first time, in what felt like forever, he was present, truly present. "I think I finally starting to understand what you mean," he admitted, his voice quiet but sincere. "It's okay to not have it all figured out. I don't have to carry it all." Madeira smiled, squeezing his hand. "You never had to, Elias." That night, as they sat together on the balcony of their hotel, watching the stars emerge in the velvet sky, Elias realized that the peace he had been searching for wasn't something to be found in a place or a moment. It was something to be nurtured in himself, with Madeira's support, and his growing willingness to trust the process. Elias was learning to let go of the past and step into the future, and for the first time, he felt ready to move forward. Okay, thank you for listening to this story. Do you want more? Do you want to know what happens to both Elias and Madeira? Do you want to know what happened at the university or at Elias' work? Or what do you want to learn more about? Please comment in down below. And if you like this story, please tell if you want me to continue or if you want me to change anything. I love doing this story. So comment and help me help Elias to make as good future as possible. Take care. Bye bye.